In the scorching badlands of New Mexico, 1879, where mercy is buried deeper than gold and justice rides on the edge of a smoking barrel, legends are born in blood and whispered in fear. They say when death walks into town, even the tumbleweeds hold their breath. But what happens when death itself faces a choice between the life it's always taken and the life it could save? This is the story of a gunslinger who earned his name through darkness, a desperate mother who had everything to lose, and the single moment that changed them both forever. What would you do if the only man who could save your baby was also the most feared killer in the West? This is the story of Clara and the gunslinger they called Death, until he stepped between a bullet and an innocent child. Subscribe now, because this tale will break your heart and rebuild it in a way you'll never forget. The sun hung like a copper coin over the dusty streets of Socorro, New Mexico, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the buildings like skeletal fingers. The afternoon heat shimmered off the ground in waves, making the air dance with mirages of water that would never come. In this godforsaken corner of the territory, hope was as scarce as rain, and justice was whatever a man could carve out with his iron. Samuel Death Coltrane rode into town on a black stallion that looked as weathered and battle-scarred as its rider. His duster coat, once brown, had faded to the color of dried blood, and his wide-brimmed hat cast shadows so deep that his eyes remained hidden, save for the occasional glint when the light caught them just right. At his hip hung a pair of Colt .45 revolvers, their grips worn smooth from countless draws, their barrels polished to a mirror shine that reflected the souls of men about to meet their maker. The townspeople scattered like leaves before a winter wind as he made his way down Main Street. Shopkeepers pulled their children inside and shuttered their windows. The saloon, usually filled with the raucous laughter of cowboys and the tinkling of an out-of-tune piano, fell silent as a tomb. Even the horses seemed to sense something ominous, shifting nervously at their hitching posts and whinnying in low, worried tones. Death dismounted at the Broken Wheel Saloon, his spurs chiming like funeral bells against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. He pushed through the batwing doors, and the handful of patrons still brave enough, or drunk enough, to remain inside held their breath. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Murphy, with arms like tree trunks and a face that had seen too many fights, continued polishing a glass with hands that trembled just slightly. "Whiskey," Death said, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The bottle." Murphy's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, mister. Just Death will do fine." The bartender placed a full bottle of rot-gut whiskey on the scarred wooden bar, along with a glass that had seen better decades. Death poured himself 2 fingers of the amber liquid and knocked it back in one smooth motion, feeling the familiar burn chase away the dust of the trail. Around him, the saloon remained frozen in time, as if everyone was afraid that even breathing too loudly might catch his attention. It had been 3 months since Death had last killed a man, a card cheat in Las Cruces who'd made the mistake of drawing on him with a hidden derringer. Before that, it was a cattle rustler in Roswell. Before that, a corrupt sheriff in Albuquerque. The list went back years, each name another notch that existed only in his memory, because Death didn't carve tallies into his gun handles like some green kid trying to build a reputation. His reputation had been built long ago, written in blood and gunpowder across the territory. He'd been born Samuel Coltrane in Missouri, the son of a preacher and a schoolteacher, destined perhaps for a quiet life of sermons and Sunday dinners. But the war had come, and with it, a hunger for violence that had consumed everything good in him. By the time he'd hung up his Confederate gray, there was nothing left of the boy who'd once helped his mother tend her garden and memorized Bible verses for Sunday school. There was only Death, and the iron at his hip, and the endless road that stretched between one killing and the next. "You're him, ain't you?" The voice came from a young cowpoke at a corner table, his voice cracking with either fear or foolish bravado. "You're the one they call Death." Death turned slowly, his movement fluid and controlled like a mountain cat preparing to strike. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, all elbows and knees and misplaced confidence. His hand rested near his gun, but his fingers trembled like autumn leaves. "I've been called many things, boy," Death replied, his voice carrying the weight of every man he'd put in the ground. Most of them true. They say you killed 30 men in Tombstone. Shot 'em all down in the street like dogs. Tombstone was a long time ago. Death poured himself another drink, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. And it wasn't 30. The boy's confidence flickered. How many was it then? Death raised the glass to his lips, paused, and looked at the boy with something that might have been pity. Enough that I stopped counting. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as someone near the door got up and hurried out into the safety of the street. Death finished his drink and left money on the bar, more than enough to cover the bottle and Murphy's silence. He touched the brim of his hat to the bartender and walked toward the door. "Mr. Death, sir?" The boy called after him, his voice smaller now. The bravado leaked out of him like water from a cracked bucket. Death paused at the doors, but didn't turn around. "What is it, son?" Why do you do it? The killing, I mean." For a moment, Death stood perfectly still, his hand resting on the door frame. The question hung in the air like smoke from a just-fired gun, and for just an instant, the mask slipped. The boy might have seen something flicker across the gunslinger's face. Pain, maybe, or regret, or just the weight of too many years carrying too many ghosts. "Because it's all I know," Death said finally, and pushed through the doors into the dying light of day. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Death of muzzle flash and blood. He untied his horse and swung up into the saddle, feeling the familiar creak of leather and the solid weight of his guns against his hips. Socorro was just another town, and tomorrow there would be another, and another after that, stretching out like an endless chain of forgettable places where forgettable people lived forgettable lives. But as he rode out of town, Death couldn't shake the memory of the boy's question, or the way it had made something deep in his chest tighten like a fist around his heart, because the truth was more complicated than what he'd told the boy. He didn't kill because it was all he knew. He killed because it was all he had left. It was the only thing that made him feel anything at all in a world that had gone cold and gray around the edges. The desert stretched out before him, vast and empty and honest in its cruelty. Somewhere out there, another job was waiting. Another man who needed killing. Another town that needed cleaning up. Another chance to feel the familiar weight of his guns and the brief, violent moment when everything made sense again. Death Coltrane rode into the gathering darkness, unaware that his next job would be unlike anything he'd ever faced before. Unaware that in a small farmhouse, not 20 miles from where he now rode, a young widow named Clara Monroe was putting her baby daughter to bed and praying to a God who seemed to have forgotten this harsh corner of his creation. Unaware that sometimes, even death can be surprised by life. The morning sun painted the Monroe farmhouse in shades of gold and amber, but Clara Monroe saw none of its beauty. She stood at her kitchen window, her 3-month-old daughter Emma sleeping fitfully in her arms, and watched 5 riders approach through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, because she knew who they were and why they'd come. The Harwick Gang, land grabbers, killers, and thieves who'd already taken so much from her that she had nothing left to lose except the baby in her arms and the deed to the 160 acres that Thomas had died defending. Clara was 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that had once sparkled with laughter but now held only the hard glint of desperation. She'd married Thomas Monroe when she was 18, full of dreams about building a life together in this harsh but beautiful land. They'd worked side by side to carve their farm from the desert, planting crops that shouldn't have grown but somehow did, raising cattle that were lean but hardy, building something real and lasting with their own hands. Then Thomas had ridden into Socorro 3 weeks ago to file a water rights claim, and he'd never come home. Sheriff Briggs had brought her the news with his hat in his hands and pity in his eyes. Thomas had been shot down in the street by Jake Harwick himself, over what Briggs claimed was a business dispute. But Clara knew the truth. The Harwicks wanted their land, wanted the precious water rights that came with it, and Thomas had been the only thing standing in their way. Now they were coming to finish what they'd started. Mama Clara, Mama Clara. 8-year-old Billy Hendricks came running from the barn, his freckled face flushed with excitement and fear. Billy was the son of their nearest neighbor, killed by Apache raiders the previous spring, and Clara had taken him in because there was nowhere else for him to go. "There's men coming. Men with guns. I see them, Billy." Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. "Go to the root cellar and don't come out until I call for you, no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" Billy nodded solemnly, understanding with the terrible wisdom that children in this country learn too young. He disappeared into the house, and Clara heard the familiar squeak of the cellar door. She adjusted Emma in her arms, making sure the baby was secure, and walked out onto the front porch to meet her husband's killers. Jake Harwick led the group, a tall man with a carefully waxed mustache and cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore expensive clothes, a black suit that probably cost more than most people in the territory made in a year, but there was nothing civilized about him. He was a predator in gentleman's clothing, and Clara had learned to read predators in the months since Thomas's death. Behind him rode his brother Pete, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull chisel. Pete Harwick was the muscle of the operation, the one who did the dirty work when Jake's silver tongue and business propositions weren't enough. Flanking them were 3 hired guns. Ace Morrison, a thin man with quick hands and dead eyes, Bull Garrett, whose nickname came from both his size and his temper, and Johnny the Snake Coulter, who was said to be faster than chain lightning and twice as deadly. They reined up in front of the house, their horses snorting and pawing at the hard-packed earth. Jake Harwick touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water, "you're looking well, considering your recent loss." "What do you want, Harwick?" Clara's voice carried no warmth, no welcome. Emma stirred in her arms, sensing her mother's tension. Now, Clara, may I call you Clara? There's no need for hostility. I'm here to make you an offer. A generous offer, considering your circumstances. The same kind of generous offer you made my husband?" Jake's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Thomas was a stubborn man. Stubborn men sometimes make poor decisions. I'd hate to see you follow in his footsteps. Pete Harwick chuckled, a sound like boulders grinding together. "Yeah, awful shame what happened to old Tom. Man shouldn't draw on his betters." "Thomas never drew on anyone in his life," Clara snapped. "You shot him down in cold blood." "Now that's a serious accusation," Jake said, still smiling. Sheriff Briggs ruled it self-defense. Fair and square. But let's not dwell on unpleasant matters. I'm here to talk business. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, holding it up so Clara could see it. "I'm prepared to offer you $500 cash for your property. That's more than generous for a hardscrabble place like this. This land is worth 10 times that, and you know it." "Worth is a relative thing, Clara. What's this place worth to a woman alone with a baby? Can you work the fields? Can you brand cattle? Can you protect what's yours when the next group of businessmen comes calling?" The threat in his words was clear as mountain water. Clara's grip tightened on Emma, and the baby began to fuss, picking up on her mother's fear. "I'm not selling," Clara said quietly. Jake sighed theatrically. "I was afraid you'd say that. You know, Clara, this is a dangerous country. Accidents happen. Apache raids. Cattle rustlers. Sometimes whole families just disappear." Bull Garrett's hand drifted toward his gun. "Real shame when that happens." Clara felt ice water flowing through her veins, but she stood her ground. "Are you threatening me, Harwick?" "Threatening? Oh, my dear Clara, I would never threaten a defenseless woman. I'm simply pointing out the realities of frontier life. This is a hard country for a woman alone, but it doesn't have to be hard for you." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Take the money, Clara. Pack up your things. Take that pretty baby of yours, and start over somewhere safe, somewhere civilized. Because if you don't—" He shrugged eloquently. "Well, accidents do happen." Clara looked at the 5 men arrayed before her, saw the guns at their hips and the hunger in their eyes, and knew with crystal clarity that they would kill her and Emma as easily as they'd killed Thomas. But she also knew that running wouldn't save them. The Harwicks had too much invested in this land to let her live, even if she signed it over to them. She'd seen too much, knew too much. She and Emma would have accidents of their own before they ever reached the safety of civilization, which left her with only one choice. A desperate, probably suicidal choice, but the only one she had. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Jake's smile widened. "Of course you do. It's a big decision. But don't take too long, Clara. My patience isn't infinite, and my associates here get restless when negotiations drag on." Johnny Coulter spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Mighty restless. 3 days," Jake said, straightening in his saddle. "I'll be back in 3 days for your answer. And Clara," his voice hardened, "choose wisely." The 5 men wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving Clara standing alone on her porch with her baby in her arms and fear clawing at her heart. She waited until they were just dust devils on the horizon before calling for Billy. The boy emerged from the cellar, his young face pale but determined. "Are they gone, Mama Clara?" For now, Clara's mind was already racing, calculating distances and possibilities. "Billy, I need you to saddle Thomas's horse. The fastest one we have." "Where are we going?" Clara looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully despite the danger that surrounded them, and made the hardest decision of her life. "I'm going to Socorro to find a man they call Death." Billy's eyes widened. "The gunfighter? But Mama Clara, everyone says he's a killer." "I know." Clara's voice was steady now, filled with grim determination. "But sometimes you need a killer to stop other killers. And right now, he's the only chance we have." As Clara prepared for her desperate journey, she didn't know that Death Coltrane was already riding toward Socorro, drawn by rumors of a job that would pay better than most. She didn't know that their paths were converging like rivers flowing toward the sea, or that their meeting would change both their lives forever. All she knew was that she had 3 days to find a miracle, and miracles in this harsh country usually came at the end of a gun. The Broken Wheel Saloon was busier than usual for a Tuesday evening, filled with cowboys spending their pay and drifters looking for work or trouble, whichever came first. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the sharp crack of a whiskey glass hitting the bar. In the corner, an old-timer played a melancholy tune on a harmonica that spoke of lost loves and broken dreams. Death Coltrane sat at his usual table in the back corner, positioned so he could see both the front door and the back exit, a habit born from years of staying alive in a profession where carelessness meant a pine box. His black coat was draped over the back of his chair, and his gun belt lay across the table, within easy reach but not openly threatening. He nursed a glass of whiskey and watched the crowd, reading the room like a man might read a newspaper. He'd been in Socorro for 2 days, waiting for his contact to show up with details about his next job. Word had come through the usual channels, a telegram from a lawyer in Santa Fe who sometimes served as an intermediary for clients who preferred anonymity. The pay was good, better than most, which meant the target was either well-protected or well-connected. Either way, it was just another job in a long line of jobs that stretched back through the years like tombstones in a cemetery. The saloon door swung open, and Death's attention focused with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. But instead of his expected contact, a young woman stepped inside, cradling a baby in her arms. The conversation in the saloon didn't exactly stop, but it dimmed noticeably as every eye in the place turned to assess this unexpected visitor. Clara Monroe looked wildly out of place in the broken wheel. Her simple blue dress was travel-stained and dusty, her auburn hair escaping from its pins, and her green eyes held the desperate gleam of someone who'd run out of options. She clutched her baby close to her chest and swept the room with her gaze until it settled on Death. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the smoky, crowded room. Death saw a young woman pushed to the breaking point, beautiful in the way that flowers are beautiful growing through cracks in stone, fragile but determined to survive. Clara saw exactly what she'd hoped to find, a man who looked like he could kill God himself if the price was right. She walked toward his table, her chin raised despite the catcalls and crude comments that followed in her wake. Murphy the bartender started to move as if to intercept her, but something in Death's expression made him think better of it and return to polishing glasses. "Mr. Death," Clara's voice carried clearly despite the noise around them, "I need to hire you." A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the nearby tables. One of the cowboys, emboldened by whiskey and the presence of his friends, called out, "Hey, lady, you sure you got the right man? Death don't work for." The cowboy's words died in his throat as Death turned to look at him. It wasn't a threatening look exactly, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. The look of a man who knew exactly how dangerous he was and had no need to prove it. The cowboy found something very interesting at the bottom of his beer mug and didn't look up again. Death gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Clara settled into the chair, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby had slept through most of the ride to Socorro, but now she was beginning to stir, making the small sounds that meant she'd be crying soon if she wasn't fed. "You know who I am," Death said. "It wasn't a question. I know what they say about you. That you're the fastest gun in the territory. That you never miss. That you've never lost a fight. And what they say is mostly true. But that doesn't explain why a decent woman would come looking for me in a place like this." Clara's composure cracked just slightly, and Death caught a glimpse of the fear and desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "Because decent men can't help me. My husband is dead, Mr. Death. Shot down by Jake Harwick and his gang 3 weeks ago. Now they want our land, and they're going to kill me and my baby to get it." Death poured himself another whiskey and considered her words. He'd heard of Jake Harwick, a land grabber with political connections and enough money to buy his way out of most legal troubles. Not the kind of man who left witnesses. Why come to me? Why not the law? Sheriff Briggs is either bought or scared. Probably both. There's no help coming from that direction. Family? Friends? All dead or driven off. We're alone, Mr. Death. Completely alone. Emma began to fuss, and Clara rocked her gently while trying to maintain eye contact with the gunslinger across from her. Death found himself studying the baby's face, red and wrinkled like all babies, but with her mother's green eyes and a shock of dark hair that stuck up in all directions. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Mrs. Monroe?" "Clara Monroe. And I'm asking you to kill Jake Harwick and his gang before they kill us." The directness of her request caught Death off guard. Most clients danced around the subject, using euphemisms and legal language to avoid saying what they really wanted. But Clara Monroe looked him straight in the eye and asked him to commit murder as casually as she might ask him to fix a broken fence. "That's 5 men, Death said. "Good men with guns who won't go down easy. It'll cost you." "How much?" "More than you have, I'd guess." Clara reached into her dress and withdrew a small leather pouch, which she placed on the table between them. "There's $200 there. It's everything we have left." Death didn't touch the pouch. $200 was good money, but not nearly enough for a job this dangerous. Jake Harwick had connections, and killing him would bring heat from territorial authorities, maybe even federal marshals. It was the kind of job that could make a man's life very complicated very quickly. "Not enough," he said. Clara's face went white. "Please. I'll find more somehow. There's no more, and we both know it." Death's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "Find another way, Mrs. Monroe. Take your baby and leave the territory. Start over somewhere else. They'll hunt us down. You know they will." Death knew she was right. Men like Jake Harwick didn't leave loose ends, and a widow who could testify about her husband's murder was definitely a loose end. But that wasn't his problem. He had his own survival to worry about. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "But the answer is no." Clara stared at him for a long moment, and Death saw something die in her eyes. Not hope, exactly, but the last pretense that the world was a place where justice existed for people like her. She stood slowly, clutching Emma close to her chest. "Then I guess we'll just have to face them alone." She turned to go, and Death told himself to let her walk away. Told himself that getting involved would only lead to complications he didn't need. told himself that he wasn't responsible for every hard luck story that walked through the saloon doors. But as Clara reached the entrance, Emma began to cry, a thin, helpless wail that cut through the noise of the saloon like a knife. And something in that sound, something in the absolute vulnerability of it, made Death remember another baby's cry from a long time ago. A baby who had died because he wasn't there to protect her. Mrs. Monroe. She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle flame in the wind. There might be another way, Death heard himself saying. I can't kill Harwick and his gang for $200, but I might be able to convince them to leave you alone. How? Death stood and strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight settling against his hips like an old friend. By making them more afraid of me than they are greedy for your land. It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could go bad in a dozen different ways. But if you're determined to see this through, then you're going to need someone watching your back. As they walked out of the saloon together, Death told himself he was making a mistake. Told himself that getting emotionally involved in a job was the fastest way to end up dead. But Emma had stopped crying, and she was looking up at him with those green eyes so much like her mother's. And for the first time in years, Death found himself caring about something other than the next job and the next bottle of whiskey. If you're still watching, tell me something. Do you believe even the darkest souls can find redemption? Hit the like button if that moment, when she cried, and he hesitated, hit you deep. Stay with us, because what comes next will change everything. He didn't know it yet, but that moment of caring would change everything. Because 3 miles outside of Socorro, Jake Harwick and his gang were already riding toward the Monroe farmhouse, tired of waiting for Clara's answer and ready to take what they wanted by force. And when they arrived to find Death Coltrane standing between them and their prize, the confrontation would test everything he thought he knew about himself, about justice, and about what it meant to be worth saving. The Monroe farmhouse stood silhouetted against the crimson sunset, like a painting of frontier determination, its modest frame structure and weathered barns speaking of honest work and simple dreams. Clara had insisted on returning home rather than hiding in town, and Death understood why. This was her ground, the place where she'd built a life with her husband and where she'd chosen to make her stand. If she was going to face Jake Harwick and his gang, she wanted to do it where she belonged. Death had spent the afternoon preparing for what was to come. He'd scouted the approaches to the house, identified cover positions, and checked his weapons with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that survival often came down to details. His Colts were clean and loaded, his rifle ready, and spare ammunition distributed in his pockets where he could reach it quickly if the shooting went long. But as he stood on the front porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon, Death found his attention drawn not to tactical considerations, but to the sounds coming from inside the house. Clara was humming softly as she prepared dinner, a melody he half remembered from childhood, something his mother might have sung while kneading bread or mending clothes. Occasionally, he heard her talking to Emma in the gentle, nonsensical way that mothers talk to babies, her voice filled with a warmth that made something tighten in his chest. Young Billy Hendricks sat on the porch steps, methodically whittling a piece of pine with a knife that was probably too big for his hands. The boy had said very little since Death's arrival, but his eyes held a mixture of fear and fascination that reminded Death uncomfortably of himself at that age, before the war, before the killing, before he'd become the thing that children whispered about in the dark. You really killed all the men they say you killed? Billy asked suddenly, not looking up from his whittling. Death considered lying, giving the boy some comfort in the form of a denial or explanation. But children in this country learned harsh truths young, and Billy had already seen more than his share of violence. Most of them, Death said quietly. You ever feel bad about it? The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a campfire. Death thought about the faces that visited him in dreams sometimes, not all of them, but enough to remind him that each pull of the trigger had ended a life that had meant something to someone. Every day, he said, and realized it was true. Billy nodded solemnly, as if this answer made perfect sense to him. Mama Clara says sometimes folks got to do bad things to stop worse things from happening. You reckon that's true? Before Death could answer, The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening air. 5 riders appeared on the horizon, backlit by the dying sun like harbingers of the apocalypse. Jake Harwick and his gang had come calling, and they weren't here to talk. "Billy, get inside," Death said calmly. "Find Clara and tell her to take Emma to the cellar. Don't come out until I call for you." The boy scrambled to his feet and disappeared through the front door. Death heard Clara's sharp intake of breath as Billy delivered his message, then the sound of hurried footsteps and a door slamming shut. The house fell silent except for the creak of settling wood and the distant sound of approaching horses. Death stepped down from the porch and walked out into the yard, stopping about 20 feet from the house. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, close to his guns, but not threatening. Not yet. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a rough semicircle with Jake Harwick at the center. Well, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The famous Death Coltrane. I have to admit, Mrs. Monroe, I didn't expect you to hire professional help." Clara emerged from the house, and Death cursed silently. He'd hoped she would stay hidden until the shooting was over, but he should have known better. This was her fight as much as his, and she had too much steel in her spine to cower in a cellar while others decided her fate. She carried Emma in her arms, the baby wrapped in a pink blanket that Clara had probably made herself during the long winter evenings when Thomas was still alive and the future had seemed full of promise. The sight of the baby in the middle of this deadly tableau struck Death as obscene. Innocence surrounded by men who dealt in violence and death. "The offer's still on the table, Clara," Jake continued, his tone conversational despite the guns arrayed around him. $500 and safe passage out of the territory. All you have to do is sign the deed over to me. And if I refuse? Clara's voice was steady, but Death could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her daughter. Jake's smile never wavered. "Then we'll take the land anyway, and you and that baby won't be around to complain about it." Pete Harwick spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Hell, Jake, why are we even talking? Let's just get this done." "Because I'm a civilized man, Pete. I prefer to handle these matters with a minimum of unpleasantness." Jake's eyes shifted to Death. Of course, Mrs. Monroe's choice of protector does complicate matters somewhat. Death said nothing, but he could see the calculations running behind Jake's eyes. 5 guns against 1, but Death's reputation preceded him. Jake was wondering if his men were good enough, fast enough, lucky enough to take down the legendary gunfighter. Death was wondering the same thing. "I know who you are, Coltrane," Jake said finally, "and I know your reputation. But reputation doesn't stop bullets, and you're outnumbered 5-1. Walk away now, and I'll consider your debt to Mrs. Monroe paid in full." "Can't do that," Death replied, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd made his choice and would live or die by it. "Why not? It's not your land. It's not your fight." Death glanced at Clara, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the determination that had brought her to the Broken Wheel Saloon looking for a killer. He looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her life hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Maybe not," Death said, "but it's my word, and that still means something." Jake sighed theatrically. "Very well. I had hoped to avoid this unpleasantness, but you forced my hand." He raised his voice slightly. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid Mr. Coltrane has chosen to make this difficult. Please be so good as to kill him." The world exploded into motion and gunfire. Bull Garrett went for his gun first, his massive hand closing around the grip of his Colt with surprising speed for such a big man. But Death was already moving, his right-hand gun clearing leather in a draw that was more reflex than conscious thought. His first shot took Bull center mass. The heavy .45 slugged, spinning the big man around and dropping him face-first into the dirt. Johnny Coulter's gun was coming up fast, the barrel swinging toward Death like the finger of doom, but Death's second shot caught him in the throat, ending his reputation as the fastest gun in 3 counties. Ace Morrison managed to get off a shot that tugged at Death's coat sleeve before Death's return fire punched through his heart and sent him tumbling backward off his horse. 3 men down in less than 2 seconds, but Pete Harwick had his gun out now, and Jake was reaching for his own weapon. Death dove to his left, rolling behind a water trough as Pete's bullet kicked up dirt where he'd been standing. He came up with both guns drawn, but before he could return fire, he heard Clara scream. Jake Harwick had dismounted and was running toward Clara and Emma, his gun aimed not at Death, but at the baby in her mother's arms. It was a smart tactical move. Take the thing Death was protecting, and the gunfighter would have to surrender or watch innocents die. "Drop your guns, Coltrane," Jake shouted. "Drop them now, or I'll put a bullet through this baby's head." Death had faced this kind of standoff before, but never with stakes this personal. He could see the madness in Jake Harwick's eyes, the desperation of a man who'd staked everything on this piece of land and wouldn't accept defeat. Jake's gun was steady, aimed directly at Emma's tiny form, and Death knew with cold certainty that the man would pull the trigger without hesitation. Time seemed to slow, the way it always did in moments like this. Death could hear his own heartbeat, could see the sweat beading on Jake's forehead, could smell the gunpowder and blood that already stained the evening air. Pete Harwick was still alive, crouched behind his horse and looking for a clear shot. Clara stood frozen, clutching Emma to her chest, her green eyes wide with terror. And in that crystalline moment of clarity, Death realized something that shook him to his core. He cared, not just about completing the job or maintaining his reputation, but about the woman and baby he'd sworn to protect. For the first time in years, he had something to lose besides his own life. "I'm waiting, Coltrane." Jake's voice cracked with nervous energy. "Drop the guns, or watch this baby die." Death began to lower his weapons, his mind racing through possibilities. If he surrendered, Jake would kill all three of them, Clara, Emma, and himself. But if he tried to take the shot, Jake might get his finger on the trigger before Death's bullet found its mark. The distance was maybe 15 feet, an easy shot under normal circumstances, but with a baby's life hanging in the balance, there was no room for error. That's when Pete Harwick made his move. The big man rose from behind his horse, his gun aimed at Death's back. In his eagerness to end the standoff, Pete had forgotten the first rule of gunfighting. Never assume your enemy is beaten until he's dead. Death heard the scrape of boot leather on stone and spun, bringing his left-hand gun around in a fluid arc. Pete's shot went wide, spoiled by haste and overconfidence. Death's return fire didn't miss, but Jake Harwick had used the distraction to close the distance. He lunged forward, grabbing Clara around the throat with his left arm while pressing his gun against Emma's head with his right. The baby began to cry, a thin wail that cut through Death like a knife. "Now I've got them both," Jake panted, his voice thick with triumph and desperation. "Drop the guns, or I'll kill them both right here, right now." Death stared into Jake's eyes and saw the truth there. The man was beyond reason, beyond mercy, beyond anything but the mad determination to have what he wanted. There would be no negotiating, no clever tricks, no last-minute reprieve. Jake Harwick was going to kill Clara and Emma no matter what Death did. But sometimes, when a man has nothing left to lose, he can find the courage to do the impossible. Death raised his guns as if to drop them, then suddenly dove forward, throwing himself between Jake's weapon and the baby. He felt the bullet punch into his chest like a sledgehammer blow, felt his ribs crack and his breath rush out in a whoosh of pain and surprise. But his momentum carried him into Jake, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. Clara stumbled backward, clutching Emma protectively as the two men rolled in the dirt. Jake was trying to bring his gun around for another shot, but Death's left hand clamped down on his wrist like a vice. Blood was spreading across Death's shirt, but adrenaline and sheer will kept him fighting. Jake's free hand found a rock and smashed it against Death's wounded chest. The gunslinger's vision went white with pain, and for a moment his grip loosened. Jake tore his gun hand free and swung the barrel toward Death's head. The shot that followed echoed across the desert like thunder, but it wasn't Jake's gun that fired. Clara Monroe stood 5 feet away, Thomas's old army Colt smoking in her hands, her face pale but determined. Jake Harwick stared at her in amazement, a spreading red stain across his expensive shirt, then toppled sideways into the dust. Death lay on his back, looking up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The pain in his chest was like nothing he'd ever felt, a burning, grinding agony that made each breath a monumental effort. He could feel blood pooling beneath him, could taste copper on his lips, and knew with the clarity that comes near death that he didn't have long. Clara knelt beside him, Emma still cradled in one arm. "Don't you dare die on me, Samuel Coltrane," she said fiercely. "Not after what you just did." Death tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Samuel," he whispered, "haven't been called that in a long time." "Well, that's who you are, isn't it? Under all that death nonsense." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're Samuel Coltrane, and you just saved my baby's life." Death felt something warm and wet on his cheek and realized Clara was crying. When was the last time someone had cried for him? When was the last time his life or death had mattered to another human being? "The baby," he managed to whisper. "Is she? She's fine. You saved her. You saved us both." Emma had stopped crying and was looking down at Death with those remarkable green eyes, one tiny fist waving in the air as if she was trying to reach him. Without thinking, Death raised his hand, and the baby's fingers closed around his index finger with surprising strength. And in that moment, lying in the dirt with his life bleeding out into the New Mexico sand, holding the hand of an innocent child he'd nearly died to protect, Death felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the cold emptiness that had sustained him through countless gunfights, but genuine peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've done something worthwhile, something that matters. "I need to get you to a doctor," Clara said, but Death shook his head weakly. "Too late for that." "But Clara," he squeezed Emma's tiny fingers, marveling at how perfectly formed they were, how full of potential and promise. "You raise her right. You tell her. Tell her that sometimes even bad men can do good things. Tell her that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even if they don't think they do." Clara's tears were falling freely now. "You can tell her yourself. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." But they both knew that wasn't true. Death could feel his strength ebbing like water from a cracked jar, could feel the cold creeping up from his extremities toward his heart. He'd seen enough dying men to recognize the signs in himself. "Take care of Billy, too," he whispered. "Kid's got good instincts. He'll help you rebuild." "Samuel, it's okay," Death said and meant it. This is a good way to go. Better than I deserved." Emma made a small sound, almost like she was trying to comfort him, and Death found himself smiling, really smiling, perhaps for the first time in years. He thought about the man he'd been before the war, before the killing, before he'd earned the name that had defined him for so long. Samuel Coltrane, son of a preacher, who'd once helped his mother in her garden and memorized Bible verses for Sunday school. Maybe that man hadn't died after all. Maybe he'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up, waiting for a desperate woman and her baby to remind him that there was more to life than gunfights and whiskey and the endless succession of meaningless towns. As consciousness faded, Samuel held onto the feeling of Emma's small fingers wrapped around his own, and the sound of Clara's voice whispering prayers into the gathering darkness. He'd lived his life as Death, feared and alone, but he was dying as Samuel, surrounded by the closest thing to family he'd known in years. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, bearing witness to the end of one story and the beginning of another. In the distance, a coyote howled, not a sound of mourning, but of wildness and freedom and the endless possibility that came with each new dawn. Samuel Coltrane closed his eyes and let go of the pain, the regret, and the weight of all those years of violence. In his final moments, he was no longer Death the gunslinger, but simply a man who had found redemption in the most unlikely place, in choosing to protect rather than destroy, to save rather than kill, to love rather than fear. And in the farmhouse where Clara Monroe would raise her daughter and tell her stories of the man who gave his life to save hers, that redemption would live on, a testament to the truth that no one is too far gone to find their way back to the light, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with the simple courage to choose hope over despair, love over fear, and life over death. The legend of Death Coltrane ended that night in the New Mexico desert, but the story of Samuel, the man who remembered how to be human when it mattered most, was just beginning. Now tell us in the comments, Did Samuel Coltrane find redemption in the end, or just pay a debt with his soul? We'd love to hear your thoughts, because every story deserves to be remembered. Here on the channel, we tell stories like this, real or imagined, but always human, raw, and transformative. If you want more tales where redemption and love rewrite fate, hit the bell and ride with us. There's always room for one more story.